The red chair was already spinning long before the cameras went live. It rotated slowly, lazily, catching the overhead lights as they washed across the studio in warm gold tones. The familiar hum of anticipation filled the space, that low, electric murmur that always hovered inside the Graham Norton Show just moments before history, comedy, or catastrophe. The air felt warmer than usual, thick with perfume, stage lights, and expectation. Somewhere above the set, unseen fans hummed softly, fighting against the heat generated by dozens of bodies packed tightly together, all waiting for the same thing. A moment. A moment that no one yet knew would fracture into something far darker. Audience members shifted in their seats, programs rustling softly. Some whispered guesses about what kind of interview this would be. Others leaned back confidently, expecting laughter, anecdotes, a few self-deprecating jokes, and the comfortable predictability that Graham Norton had perfected over decades. The band adjusted their instruments in the corner, fingers hovering, ready to punctuate jokes with musical cues that had become second nature. And at the center of it all sat Graham himself. Relaxed. Polished. At ease. He stood just off camera, jacket perfectly tailored, tie loosened just enough to signal casual authority. His posture was loose, practiced. This was his kingdom. The red sofa, the glowing audience, the invisible millions watching at home, it all belonged to him in these moments. A mischievous spark danced behind his eyes as he glanced toward the stage entrance, already crafting the tone of the conversation in his mind. This would be good television. The familiar theme music swelled, applause erupted on cue, and Graham stepped forward into the light, arms open, smile wide. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth and welcoming, "welcome back." The audience roared. The cameras rolled closer, capturing the ease in his expression, the comfort of a man who knew exactly how to command a room. He waited just long enough for the applause to peak, then gently raised a hand, letting the sound taper off like a conductor controlling an orchestra. "Now," he continued, a playful lilt in his tone, "my next guest needs very little introduction." A pause. Perfectly timed. She's an actress, a philanthropist, and one of the most talked about women on the planet. Another beat. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Meghan Markle." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Applause thundered through the studio, mixed with whistles, cheers, and a palpable buzz of curiosity. The doors parted, and she appeared. Meghan stepped onto the set with practiced confidence, her posture tall, shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to project poise without arrogance. She wore an elegant black dress, understated but deliberate, the fabric catching the light as she moved. It shimmered subtly, not flashy, but impossible to ignore. Her hair was styled flawlessly, every strand in place. The smile she offered the audience was warm, polished, and perfectly calibrated, the kind of smile that had been analyzed, praised, and criticized 1,000 times before. She waved as she crossed the stage, heels clicking softly against the floor, each step measured. Cameras tracked her from every angle, capturing the confidence, the grace, the familiarity of someone who knew exactly how this dance was supposed to go. Yet beneath the smile, beneath the smooth exterior, there was something else. A tightness. A subtle restraint in her eyes that only the most attentive observer might catch. A flicker of awareness. Of caution. As she reached the red sofa, Graham rose to greet her, leaning in for the customary air kisses. "Meghan, wonderful to have you here," he said brightly. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you, Graham," she replied, her voice warm, controlled. "It's lovely to be here." She settled into the sofa, crossing her legs with effortless elegance, hands folding neatly in her lap. The audience applauded again, then slowly quieted, leaning forward in anticipation. From the control room, producers exchanged satisfied glances. Everything was going exactly as planned. Or so it seemed. Graham took his seat opposite her, turning slightly to face her fully. The lights softened, cameras adjusted, and the studio slipped into that familiar rhythm, the unspoken agreement between host, guest, and audience that this would be entertaining. Revealing, but safe. Graham tilted his head, smile widening. "Now, Meghan," he began casually, "I have to say, you've been making quite a few headlines lately." A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd. "Some might even say you've become Britain's most talked about export," he continued, pausing just long enough to let it land, "even if you're not technically British anymore." The audience laughed again, louder this time. Meghan smiled, but this time, the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well," she replied carefully, her tone measured, "I think it's interesting how the media chooses to frame certain narratives. I'm here to discuss my new projects, not to relive the past." There it was. Subtle. Polite. But firm. Graham's eyes glinted with interest. "Oh, but the past is often far more interesting than the present, isn't it?" He replied smoothly, the words wrapped in humor but edged with intention. "I mean, you've gone from suits to suits of armor, metaphorically speaking." Laughter erupted again, but this time it felt thinner. More cautious. Meghan shifted slightly on the sofa, her shoulders tightening just a fraction. Media training kicked in. Immediately, a small nod, a composed expression, a controlled breath. "I prefer to focus on moving forward," she said. "I care deeply about the work I'm doing now. The causes I believe in." "Yes, of course," Graham nodded, lips still curved in a smile. But his eyes lingered on her, searching. "Though surely you can understand the public's fascination with your story. It's not every day someone walks away from a fairy tale." The word fairy tale landed heavier than expected. A hush fell over the studio, not silence, but awareness. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her fingers clasped together a little more firmly in her lap. "That's a rather simplistic way to describe a very complex situation," she replied. "Oh, I'm sure it was complex," Graham said lightly. "But from the outside, it did seem like someone deciding the crown was simply too heavy." The laughter this time was hesitant. The atmosphere shifted. Cameras caught it. The audience felt it. Even the band paused, sensing the tonal change. Meghan inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "There's a difference," she said, carefully choosing each word, "between choosing your own path and running away from responsibility. I've never run from anything in my life." Graham leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on his knees. His playful demeanor sharpened, curiosity turning into challenge. "But would you say you ran towards something better?" he asked. "Because that's what everyone wants to know, isn't it? Was it worth it?" The question hung in the air. Heavy. Loaded. Meghan's eyes flashed, anger, restraint, calculation, all in the span of a heartbeat. "I don't believe I need to justify my personal choices to anyone," she said, her voice steady but colder now. "Especially not on television." "Well," Graham chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes, "that is rather the point of being on television, isn't it?" A few uneasy laughs followed. "Otherwise," he added, "you could have stayed home and sent out a press release." The studio fell silent. Not a cough. Not a shuffle. Silence. Meghan stared at him, the polished veneer beginning to crack. "I came here in good faith," she said slowly. "I was told this would be a friendly discussion about my current work. Not a character assassination." Graham's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Character assassination?" he repeated. "My dear Meghan, I'm simply asking the questions any reasonable person would ask." A beat. "Surely you expected that." "I expected professionalism," she replied coolly. "The same respect you give your other guests." "Oh, but I am treating you with respect," Graham said, a trace of passive aggression slipping into his tone. "I'm treating you like any other public figure who makes controversial choices and expects everyone to accept them without question." Something shifted in Meghan then. Her posture straightened. Her composure tightened, not calming, but bracing. The gloves hadn't come off yet. But they were loosening. And as the audience leaned forward, sensing something they'd never seen before on this beloved stage, the cameras continued to roll, capturing the moment just before everything went wrong. Because this wasn't just banter anymore. This was the first crack in a facade that was about to shatter. And no one, not the producers, not the audience, not even Graham Norton himself, yet realized they were seconds away from witnessing one of the most explosive confrontations television had ever seen. The temperature in the studio felt like it had risen several degrees, though nothing had physically changed. The lights were the same. The cameras still rolled. The audience remained seated. And yet, the atmosphere had shifted into something dense and uncomfortable, like air before a storm. You could feel it pressing against skin, against nerves, against restraint. Graham Norton leaned back slightly, his trademark smile still present, but altered now, thinner, sharper, no longer playful. It was the smile of a man who sensed resistance and decided, consciously or not, to push harder. Meghan Markle sat rigid on the red sofa, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The elegance was still there, but it had transformed. This was no longer the relaxed poise of a guest enjoying a late-night chat. This was defensive composure, armor hastily reinforced under fire. "You see," Graham continued, voice smooth but firm, "when someone steps into the public eye the way you have, scrutiny becomes part of the deal." Meghan's lips pressed into a tight line. She blinked slowly, deliberately. "I understand scrutiny," she said. "What I don't understand is why it so often turns into hostility." "Hostility?" Graham echoed, tilting his head. "Or accountability?" The word landed like a slap. A murmur rippled through the audience. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, eyes wide, sensing they were watching something that would not be easily undone. "Accountability," Meghan repeated, a quiet incredulity creeping into her voice. "For what, exactly?" "For your choices," Graham replied without hesitation. "For the consequences that followed." Meghan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You say that as if the consequences were reasonable," she shot back. "As if what followed was proportionate or deserved." Graham's gaze never left her face. "Some would argue," he said calmly, "that when you leave a centuries-old institution in such a dramatic fashion, there are bound to be repercussions." "Repercussions?" Meghan's voice rose slightly now, the careful modulation beginning to crack. "Being vilified? Being dehumanized? Having my mental health questioned publicly?" The audience went still. Mental health. That phrase alone carried weight, pulling the room into deeper waters. Graham's expression flickered, just briefly, before he masked it again. "I'm not dismissing your feelings," he said, though his tone suggested a pivot rather than empathy. "I'm saying that many people feel you controlled the narrative very selectively." Meghan leaned forward now, elbows resting on her knees, eyes locked on him. "Controlled the narrative?" she repeated. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have your story told for you? To watch strangers decide who you are based on headlines and anonymous sources? And yet," Graham countered, "you've told your story. Repeatedly. On your terms." The audience collectively inhaled. There it was, the pivot. The accusation sharpened, the subtext no longer hidden. "So now I'm not allowed to speak?" Meghan asked, incredulous. "I'm not allowed to defend myself?" "You're allowed to speak," Graham said evenly. "But people are allowed to question why." Meghan shook her head slowly, disbelief etched across her face. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. "No matter what I do, it's wrong. Stay silent, I'm complicit. Speak up, I'm manipulative." Graham folded his hands together, posture firm. "Or," he said, "you're someone who wants sympathy without scrutiny." A sharp gasp cut through the audience. Meghan froze. For a split second, the studio lights seemed harsher, the silence louder. Even the cameras felt closer now, lenses trained on her reaction, capturing every micro-expression, the tightening jaw, the flare of nostrils, the flash of something. He answered. The tension had crossed a threshold. This was no longer an interview spiraling unintentionally. This was a confrontation, two narratives colliding head-on, neither willing to yield. "I did not come here to beg for sympathy," Meghan said, voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. "I came here to talk about my work." "And yet," Graham replied, "we keep circling back to this." "Because you won't let it go," Meghan snapped. A few nervous laughs bubbled up, quickly dying. Graham raised an eyebrow. "I'm following where the conversation leads." "No," Meghan said firmly. "You're steering it." The audience could feel it, the invisible tug-of-war playing out between them. Each word tightened the rope, each response pulling harder. "Let me ask you something," Graham said, leaning forward again. "Do you accept that some of the criticism you've received might be fair?" Meghan stared at him, stunned. "Fair?" she repeated. "To be accused of things without evidence? To have my motives dissected by people who have never met me?" "Yes," Graham said simply. "Fair." The room went dead quiet. This time, no one even shifted. Meghan's voice dropped, lower now, controlled in a way that signaled danger. "I will not accept abuse as fair criticism," she said. "And I will not apologize for protecting myself." Graham exhaled sharply, irritation breaking through his composure. "And I will not pretend," he snapped, "that you didn't know exactly what you were doing when you made those choices." There it was. Open hostility. The audience could feel Graham's frustration now, his patience thinning, his legendary charm cracking under pressure. "You walked away," he continued, voice rising. "You spoke out. You profited from the attention. And now you're offended that people question you." Meghan stood abruptly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the audience. For a moment, it looked like she might leave right then and there. She stood rigid, chest rising and falling rapidly, hands clenched at her sides. "I did not profit from my pain," she said, each word carefully enunciated. "And the fact that you'd reduce my experience to a transaction says far more about you than it does about me." Graham rose as well, the symmetry unmistakable now, two figures standing, facing each other across the red sofa like adversaries. "You gained freedom," he shot back. "You gained influence. You gained control. At what cost?" Meghan demanded. Silence answered her. Not because there was no response, but because the question cut too close to something unresolved. The audience shifted again, the room buzzing with nervous energy. In the control room, producers exchanged frantic glances. Fingers hovered over buttons. Should they cut? Go to commercial? Or let it unfold? Graham broke the silence first. "You're not the only person who suffered," he said, his voice quieter but sharper. "Others were affected by your decisions." Meghan's eyes burned. "And you think I don't know that?" she asked. "You think that doesn't haunt me?" Graham hesitated. Just for a moment. But pride pushed him forward. "I think," he said carefully, "that you've been very selective about whose suffering matters." The words hit hard. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Someone else shook their head slowly in disbelief. Meghan's composure finally cracked. "You have no right," she said, voice shaking with restrained fury. "No right to tell me what matters to me." "And you have no right," Graham replied, equally firm, "to demand unquestioning support from the public." They stood there, breathing hard, eyes locked, neither backing down. This was no longer about headlines. This was about control. About power. About who got to define truth. Meghan reached for her bag, fingers trembling slightly as she lifted it from beside the sofa. "I will not continue this conversation," she said. "Not like this." Graham crossed his arms. "Running away again?" he asked coolly. The insult was deliberate. Calculated. And it landed exactly as intended. Meghan turned slowly, her face pale, eyes blazing. "That's enough," she said, her voice deadly calm. "I will not be spoken to like this." The studio felt like it was holding its breath. Graham stared back at her, jaw set, anger flickering behind his eyes. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "this isn't the right platform for you." The words hung in the air, ambiguous, dangerous, final. The audience sensed it instantly. Something irreversible had just been said. Meghan took a step toward the exit, then stopped. She turned back one last time, her gaze cutting through the lights, the cameras, the audience, straight to Graham. "You invited me here," she said quietly. "And you turned this into a spectacle." Graham's response was immediate, clipped, and shocking. "And now," he said, his voice echoing through the stunned studio, "security will escort you out." A collective gasp swept through the room. Meghan froze. Time itself seemed to slow, the hum of lights. The distant rustle of clothing, the stunned silence of hundreds of witnesses. Security. No one had ever heard those words spoken on this stage like that. Meghan stared at him, disbelief giving way to icy resolve. "I don't need security," she said softly. And as she took her first step toward the exit, the entire studio watched, knowing, without question, that whatever happened next would change everything. Meghan Markle didn't rush toward the exit. She didn't storm off. She didn't collapse into theatrics or shout one final insult over her shoulder. Instead, she walked, slow, deliberate, spine straight, head held high, each step echoing across the studio floor louder than any applause ever had. The click of her heels sounded unnaturally sharp now, cutting through the stunned silence like a metronome counting down the end of something far bigger than an interview. The audience didn't know what to do. Some sat frozen, mouths slightly open, eyes darting between Meghan's retreating figure and Graham Norton, who remained standing beside the red sofa, his chest rising and falling as if he'd just run a race he hadn't fully prepared for. Others instinctively began to clap, not loudly, not confidently, just a few scattered hands, uncertain, apologetic, immediately swallowed by the overwhelming tension. The applause died almost as soon as it began. Meghan reached the edge of the stage and paused. For just a moment. Not to look back. Not to say anything. But long enough for the weight of the moment to settle fully into the room. Long enough for every camera to catch the curve of her shoulders, rigid but unbroken. Long enough for millions watching at home to feel it too, that sharp, uncomfortable realization that this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was fallout. She disappeared through the studio doors, and when they closed behind her, the sound was deafening. A dull, final thud. Graham remained standing, staring at the space she'd occupied seconds earlier. The red sofa looked strangely empty now, almost accusatory in its brightness. He swallowed hard, lips pressed together, hands clenched at his sides. For the first time all night, he looked unsure. The audience, Waited for him to speak. They always did. That was the rhythm. The host regains control. A joke. A smooth transition. Laughter restores order. But this time, the silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. An eternity in live television. Graham cleared his throat and forced a chuckle that landed wrong, thin and hollow. "Well," he said finally, voice uneven, "that was unexpected." A few nervous laughs flickered through the crowd, quickly dying under the weight of the moment. He glanced toward the cameras, then toward the band, then back at the sofa, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. The producers were already waving frantically from the wings, signaling him to wrap it up, to move on. To salvage something. But salvage felt impossible now. Because everyone in that room knew what they'd just witnessed. A line had been crossed. And once crossed, it couldn't be uncrossed. Graham sank back onto his chair, adjusting his jacket with hands that betrayed a faint tremor. His charm, the effortless, invincible confidence that had defined his career, had fractured. Not shattered completely, but cracked enough for people to notice. "We'll take a short break," he said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. The cameras faded out. The studio lights dimmed slightly. But the tension didn't leave with the broadcast. Behind the scenes, chaos erupted. Producers argued in hushed, urgent tones. Assistants rushed between corridors, phones already buzzing with alerts, messages, notifications. Social media feeds exploded in real time, clips spreading faster than anyone could contain them. Headlines were being written before the episode even finished airing. Outside the studio, Meghan stood alone in the corridor, the air suddenly cooler, quieter, real. Her hands shook now, just slightly, as the adrenaline drained from her body. She exhaled, a long, trembling breath, pressing her palm briefly against the wall to steady herself. The polished composure she'd maintained under the lights finally slipped, revealing the raw exhaustion beneath. Not regret. But release. She hadn't lost control. She'd reclaimed it. A member of the production staff hovered nearby, uncertain, apologetic, offering water she didn't take. Meghan nodded once, silently, and continued walking, past posters of past guests, past framed smiles and glossy memories of safer television moments. This one wouldn't join them. Inside the studio, Graham sat motionless during the break, staring at the floor. The applause sign flickered back on, demanding energy the room no longer had. He nodded when the director spoke into his earpiece, but his eyes were distant. He replayed it all in his head. The questions. The tone. The moment he'd pushed too far. For years, he'd prided himself on being untouchable, the host who could say anything, ask anything, and still be loved. Tonight had challenged that illusion. When the show resumed, the laughter felt forced. The jokes didn't land. The audience remained polite but subdued, their attention fractured, minds still replaying the confrontation they couldn't unsee. Graham powered through the rest of the program on muscle memory alone, smiling when expected, laughing when cued, but something fundamental had shifted. By the time the credits rolled, the damage was already done. Clips of Meghan's exit dominated every platform. Some called it a brutal ambush. Others called it long overdue accountability. Think pieces bloomed overnight, dissecting every word, every expression, every pause. Was Graham too aggressive? Was Meghan too defensive? Or had the collision been inevitable, a perfect storm of celebrity, power, ego, and unresolved resentment? Public opinion fractured instantly. Supporters praised Meghan for standing her ground, for refusing to be humiliated on live television. Critics accused her of avoiding responsibility, of walking away when challenged. Graham, once universally adored, found himself under scrutiny he wasn't used to, his interviewing style questioned, his intent analyzed, his reputation no longer immune. And yet, in the quiet moments afterward, away from cameras and commentary, a simpler truth lingered. This wasn't just about two public figures clashing. It was about control. About who gets to ask the questions. About who gets to define the narrative. About how quickly entertainment turns